I experienced a very horrific sexual assault that then got me sober eventually. It was one of the major pivot points after multiple times trying to end my life. I met
Mariya Javed is a licensed independent clinical social worker, a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and an international brain spotting trainer and consultant.
She offers therapy intensive for complex PTSD and addictions for clients work with her to get to the root of traumatic experiences. Mariya Javed-Payne.
I met shamanic practitioner. So working on the spiritual side of things really helped ground me in some hope or having some direction. But I was experiencing PTSD very significantly. I didn't leave my house for like 4 years.
Do you bring in humor?
Absolutely, but trauma work is heavy stuff.
Welcome back to The Boundless Body. So check this out. 63.5% of you who are regular listeners haven't subscribed yet to the show. So please take a moment. It would be really helpful to click subscribe. It's free of charge. It will really help us out. In turn, we'll help you out by bringing you better and better content. Along those lines, send us an email with your feedback, boundlessbodypod@gmail.com. Send us your feedback about how you think we can do better. Give us questions to address on the show, interviewees you'd like us to interview. It'd be super helpful. You're going to love this jam with Mariya Javed. She starts off by talking about her journey with addiction and how brain spotting helped her out of the pit. Brain spotting is a trauma resolution modality that works directly with the brain and directly with trauma. We talk about some of the distinctions between EMDR and brain spotting because both work with the eyes. I mobilize some of the cerebellar research that I've been immersed in over the years and how and why that applies to the distinction between EMDR and brain spotting and why it's important. We then move on to a deep and clear discussion about the sociological layer in therapy and the cultural layer in therapy. And she offers some really interesting perspectives and a really grounded approach, well-balanced approach to some of the cultural clusterfucks that we find ourselves embedded in this day and age. So I was really excited to share some quotes from Robin Dunbar, for example, singing is grooming at a distance. I just love that. And I hope you enjoy the show. Mariya, welcome to The Boundless Body.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to jump in. We've got a lot to cover today. You know, from brain spotting to shamanistic work to the cultural mayhem that we find ourselves in these days, and ancestral work and all that stuff.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Mariya Javed is a licensed independent clinical social worker, a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and an international brain spotting trainer and consultant. She is a somatic psychotherapist and the owner of Awaken Consulting Services, a private practice and consultancy where she utilizes brain spotting therapy and offers training and consultation on the treatment of trauma, somatic psychotherapies, psychedelic assisted therapy, and other relevant mental health topics, including anti-racism. She offers therapy intensives for complex PTSD and addictions, where clients work with her for multiple hours a day for a number of days to get to the root of traumatic experiences. All right. So in our warm-up, we talked a little bit about, what we've been talking about on The Boundless Body. We often start with initiatory processes, like what was the suffering that got you into being the helper that you are today? So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your process with addiction and some of the difficult experiences in your early family upbringing that were part of what brought you to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. Quite a journey. I am an immigrant. So I came to the United States when I was 6 years old. I was born in India. I lived in India and then France and then Brazil, all before the age of 6, and then came to the United States with my parents and my brother. And immediately the process of assimilating and intertwining with, the culture here has been one of the defining features of my lived experience. Belonging, of meaning, of value, of connection, of community. So those themes have played a huge role in my foundation from the beginning. Maybe certain things that people never have to think about because they grew up in the same place or they have people that look like them, living around them. That wasn't my experience because we moved around so much. And every time I started to settle in, it's like I would get uprooted and we'd have to learn a new language and have to meet, new people and learn a whole new culture. And then we do it again 4 different times before age 6. So as I got older and, got into my teens, a very big rift inside of me, inside of my psyche. I was raised in Islam as well. And so quite strict upbringing. My parents were very, very protective over my brother and I, and didn't want a lot of the things that they saw in quote unquote American culture to infiltrate, their children. So there was a loyalty battle from the beginning of like, am I going to be loyal to my family and my people, which is, coming from a collectivist culture, a huge way of life, or am I going to find out who I am and my own identity separate from that? And so around age 13 or so, it started to really ask and then eventually demand my autonomy. And that led to some significant ruptures in my familial relationships and with the religion. And it did a number on my mental health and physical well-being. I'm a really deeply sensitive person, very big-hearted, deeply loyal, deeply caring. And so I felt very torn, especially because my parents were all I had. It's like my brother and my parents were all I had. I didn't have anybody else really. There was no grandparents or aunts or uncles and cousins around us. It was, if you don't have them, you're really like making a decision to abandon your lineage and you're taking a huge risk. And at the time, I didn't really feel like I had a choice because I felt like I was suffocating and there was no room for me to be who I was in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, that's when the drugs came in, and it was a means to cope with that assimilation, trauma. And I was very quickly addicted to, some of the harder drugs and opiates as, when the opiate epidemic was rising. And yeah, I was an IV drug user at I think like age 16 and did a lot of cocaine and then eventually got addicted to crack cocaine for 3 years and went to rehab 8 times and didn't stay sober even after that. So my parents did send me to treatment many, many times. And eventually they kind of gave up. I gave up, moved to Minnesota because of rehab. So grew up, the second half of my life has been, in Minnesota, which has been a time of healing and of recovery and reclamation and taking the mud from the earlier half of my life and turning it into something useful and meaningful. It's not been an easy road. I really struggled a lot with many, many traumatic things that happened in my addiction, which is the case for most of us who are caught in that. And yeah, in 2010, when I finally got sober, I found myself very, very deeply physically ill with some illnesses that I had acquired in my addiction, and also very spiritually and psychically ill and walking on the precipice of insanity for a good amount of years. Psychosis, if you want to call it that, or on the spiritual realm, you would call it as getting blasted open. So one of my teachers told me years ago that when people have an awakening, sometimes like light awakening, that they're waking up to powerful good forces in the world. And she's like, you got blasted open by the dark. So my lived experience as a healer has really been from the place of the shadow and walking in that fine line of the dark and the light and how they interplay with one another. I will give myself credit that I never gave up and that I wanted to give up the whole time. So there's something inside of me that's like, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to be stubborn. And it's the life force inside that drives us, I think, towards hope. But it's taken a lot of work to get here. And I still deal with a lot of medical. It's a defining struggle of my life now is physically healing, because I've had a lot of illnesses since I contracted a viral infection in my drug use, and it changed the shape of my life in sobriety. So it takes a lot for me to physically be able to function on a day-to-day basis at this time. Less mental now, although that plays a part, physical, mental, spiritual is all connected.
Well, thank you so much for coming heart wide open and being transparent and telling us your story. And you mentioned the mud from this era of your life. And I got to thinking, because there's this wonderful book called Creation Myths of the World, David Leeming's book, where he looks at just, hundreds and hundreds of different cultures and their different narratives and stories about how the world began, how the universe began, how the culture began. And he divides the themes into basically 5 mega themes that just keep on recurring throughout humanity cross-culturally. And one of them is called the creation mythology of the earth diver type, where often you have, like, for example, you have a muskrat in American Indian cosmology going down to the bottom of the ocean to pick up a piece of mud. And that's where the culture begins. That's where the world begins. So that's where I go with it. I get the tingle response just thinking about it, right? Just like the earth diver down in the depths of the darkness and the pressure, right? The pressure down there in the dark and in the depths. It's shattering. The pressure is shattering.
That's a good word for it. It was, 2010 was shattering into a million pieces, just shards of glass everywhere. And I've spent the last, 15 years putting each little piece, and there's still, a lifetime to go, but.
Yeah. And you got your ground to stand on, the mud, to start to gather those pieces back. And Brainspotting was a huge encounter for you. Yeah. Like, cause you were in the rehab scene. What's that big place in Minnesota? The big Hazelden. Yeah. I'm from Minnesota too. Right. So I had it in there somewhere, Hazelden. I just didn't. So you went to Hazelden?
That was my second to last treatment center. I was there for 6 months and I got high and I got kicked out. So yeah.
All right.
What addicts do is get high, right? So then we kick them out for doing what they do.
And then it was really with Brainspotting. Did I hear you right before? It was really with Brainspotting that was a significant pivot point for you.
Yeah. It was one of the major pivot points. The pivot point finally in sobriety was I experienced a very horrific sexual assault that then got me sober eventually after multiple times trying to end my life. And then through that experience, I was experiencing psychosis, like from all the drugs and everything. And I met a shamanic practitioner, shamanic worker, and I opened spiritually at that point in that relationship in late 2010. So working on the spiritual side of things really helped ground me in some hope or having some direction. But I was experiencing PTSD very significantly. I didn't leave my house for like 4 years after that happened. So I was going to therapy and doing talk therapy. I had a really wonderful therapist that I was doing healing work with. But it wasn't until 7 years into my sobriety that I stumbled upon Brainspotting with a therapist, went and did a session, and I walked out thinking, oh my gosh, I just did 6 months of therapy in an hour. Like, where has this been in all of the scene, right? Like, I've been in it since I was like 13 years old. I've never had this experience before. I've tried EMDR, I've done all this stuff, and it really changed my life. And I committed to going every week, and I did every week for like 5 years. And that is what pieced all those shards of glass, bit by bit back together into the nervous system that I have today that is able to do what I do today. So I was a non-functioning human for a long time.
So it's possible that significant amount of listeners haven't heard about brain spotting and don't really have a map or an image of, what that looks like, that type of therapy, and what are some of the theoretical pillars
Sure.
holding up the practice. Could you just kind of give us an overview?
Absolutely. Yeah. Brain spotting is a bottom-up somatic psychotherapy, although I would say that it goes beyond just being a psychotherapy, depending on who is wielding it or holding the space for it. But we harness the orienting reflex in brain spotting. So we, as humans, mammals, living beings, we orient to our environment through our senses. And brain spotting in particular focuses on all of the senses, but especially the tactile, so the sensory, the sensations of the body, the felt sense experience, connected with the sense of vision. So our visual processing centers inside of the deep brain are intimately connected with our survival reflexes and our motor coordination, memory making. Our eyes, our optic nerve actually sits right above the amygdala as it goes in. So it is communicating information very rapidly to the alarm center of the brain. So our eyes have a ton to do with psychology. We've not really known this. And our psychology is reflected in our physiology. Our physiology is reflected in our psychology. It's bidirectional. So the process of brain spotting is getting access to the felt sense experience of whatever it is that is unmetabolized or unfinished in the body related to a trauma response, because that's what trauma does, is it leaves fragments of information and energy inside the body without getting to fully kind of complete because it gets overwhelmed. So in a brain spotting session, we would be asking the client to bring up an issue, whatever it is they want to work on. It doesn't have to be a memory. It can be anything. If you can think of it and conjure it, we can find a brain spot for it. And so let's say I'm talking about having, just really deep depression. And I don't know why. I don't know where it comes from, but I just feel depressed. So we get into the felt sense of what that depression feels like and locate where it is in the body or around the body. If people struggle with feeling things or interocepting in their body, there's other ways we can, however it's real for the human. And then we find an eye position that correlates or strengthens or gives more access to that felt sense experience. So if I had a client working on depression, I would use a pointer or just noticing where their gaze keeps going. And I would use a pointer to help locate in their visual field where they feel more connected to that felt sense of maybe heaviness or sluggishness or sadness. And there's going to be a spot or multiple spots in the visual field that people are like, oh my God, it's way worse over there. There's something over there. And so then we find exactly where it is in the visual field and then hold the client's eye position there while we then engage the prefrontal cortex to allow awareness and noticing, observing what happens to the sensations as you're being held on the eye position. So what is an eye position? What does that have to do with anything? The eyes are essentially the scanners of the brain. So when I'm looking at you right now, I'm actually looking at your brain. Okay. And it's looking at me. And yeah, exactly. So our brain uses our eyes to scan for information. I'm looking out in the world. It's taking in this information through the visual sense, and then the brain's making sense of what's being observed. We found in brain spotting that the brain also uses the eyes to find information within itself and within the body. So, for example, if you've ever been deep in thought and you noticed you were staring off into space and you're looking at it in a particular direction, that's a brain spot. That is your brain using the eyes to fixate, orient, on a focal position as it accesses the information that you're thinking about. So it's like a supercharged neural network, a highway that's holding the information that we're actively bringing up in a session to work on. And the fixating helps brain focus, it helps access, and then it helps turn on the self-scanning capacities that are inside of all of our brains. And what I mean by that is our brain is scanning 24/7 to keep us in homeostasis. It's like, oh, there's cells over here that we have a little virus coming in. We got to have white blood cells go. Oh, we have a cut. We got to like bring and build a scat. 24/7, it is keeping track of our homeostasis. We're either in homeostasis or the body is trying to seek homeostasis. It's not anything outside of that when we're alive. So when I say that focusing on a spot turns on these self-scanning capacities, the brain essentially can go, oh, there's that thing that's connected to this heaviness or tension I'm feeling. There's that thing from like 20 years ago that we forgot about. Lost context for dissociation. We forget. We don't have, the tools at this time. So we had to tuck it away. And people will have memories start to come up and sensations and images and other things. And it's like you're going down just a train ride of different things that come up. And as the client is having these experiences come up, thoughts, emotions, sensations, anything in the neuro experience, what it means to be alive. Mindfully focusing on those experiences helps to then complete the survival responses that are stored and do a process of memory reconsolidation. So essentially that's what Brainspotting is doing. It's similar to somatic experiencing. It came from EMDR originally. David Grand, who developed Brainspotting, was an EMDR clinician, but he was playing around with EMDR, and then he one day stumbled on this interesting reflex that he saw in one of his clients' eyes, where her eye was doing a little freeze wobble movement every time he was doing the bilateral.
Yeah.
And he stopped right there for some reason that day. And
he broke the rules. You're not supposed to do creative stuff in the EMDR protocol. He broke it. Yeah, he's a transgressor.
Yeah. Why Brainspotting is its own thing now.
Yeah.
And we don't have protocols actually in Brainspotting. We don't have rules. We don't have protocols. We don't believe in that.
Yeah, it's exploration, right? You're exploring collaboratively to find the spot that opens something up, that gets something going, some process that's locked up in the brain in terms of processing, or in the body somatically, or both, or maybe even neither, because you've made a space for the neither. You've made a space for the other, for spirit, and for the mystery.
Yeah.
And then so basically you find that spot, and you're encouraging them to hold that spot in terms of their gaze. So let's say it's, they're looking up and to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the spot that's like bingo. And you're looking up and to the right, and you have them hold that for a bit while they're tracking sensations, and maybe memories come up, or images, or something like that. You get them to toggle their eyes closed sometimes, just to focus. And because it can be, because eyes, they take up so much metabolic juice in the brain as well.
Yes, they do. Yeah, I think it's 60% of the resources in the brain have something to do with visual processing.
Yeah.
Pretty high number. Yes, people can open their eyes, close their eyes. They can move their bodies however they want to. They can talk or not talk. In fact, a lot of the processing can be quite silent, because language pulls you out of the midbrain. It pulls you out into the neocortex. So we actually, whenever possible, encourage silence. And we don't force people to stay at the spot. So if the brain is wanting to look somewhere else, or it's orienting in a different direction or multiple directions, we follow that and see, because we trust in the innate wisdom of the brain. It's way smarter than anything I could see and interpret, with a client. So we allow a lot of curiosity and explore, like you were saying. But yes, essentially, Brainspotting is focal eye position processing versus eye movement, but there are frames in brain spotting that are eye movement oriented.
And do you use tactile stimulation as well? Like stimulation, like in EMDR, there's bilateral stimulation as an alternative to the eye movement, bilateral stimulation. Do you use any kind of tactile approaches, tactile stimulation, touch?
We can add it in if the client needs it. Bilateral stim comes from auditory. We have headphones that play bilateral music that moves from ear to ear, and it's panned in a specific way to be more integrative than just bilateral stim. And it's optional though. So if, like, you can see my headphones right there, people use it, but they may or may not want to. And again, it's so flexible. Brain spotting is so flexible. It's so integrative. You can use it as a full session. You can use a piece or a part of it. You can do it for 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and truly meet people where they are. Not just like, people say that all the time. You know, I heard that growing up in school when we meet our clients where they're at. But in the structure of whatever we had to do with our client, we aren't doing that. Right. It's still the therapist is leading. It's still like, we're supposed to have the answers. We're supposed to be certain. We're supposed to diagnose. We're supposed to da 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 da. In brain spotting, these philosophies of being client centered are built in to how we do the work. So it's like, you don't lead the client. You sit and be quiet and see what comes up. And then you follow the client's neurophysiology. You follow the client's lead. And I find it to be as anti-oppressive of an approach that I've, ever learned. It centers all of that. And that's very meaningful to me in the type of work I do.
Yeah. Yeah. You need freedom. You need to have autonomy. You need to space for transgression, for openness, you need an open system.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we all do. If I'm so bold.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that, turned me off about EMDR is and I get it, because there needs to be proof and data to be an evidence-based model. So you need the protocols in order to go in that direction in many ways so that you can test it and reproduce. So like, I kind of get it, but when I went to one of my first weekends and they said, do not be creative, as if it was like the Abrahamic God or something like that. Thou shalt be punished if thou does not live by the dogma. I'm similar to you in spirit, where I just get an allergic response. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, like my glands are swollen or something like that.
Yes, I can relate.
Yeah. Because like, I'd been a somatic practitioner for over 20 years and working with trauma for over 20 years. Plus, I'd been exposed to a lot of somatic experience type processing, which happens at a different pace, a different rhythm. And I already been working with eyes in such a way that I know that a slower pacing structure is simply what some people need.
Yeah.
And that's just what shows up clinically. Like, a really common response to trauma is that the eyes are going all over the place. And they're dysregulated and there's no place to orient.
Correct.
And it's just like at sea. The nervous system and the brain are at sea. And if you just add rapid stimulation to that, it's not going to be grounding for everybody. In fact, quite the contrary.
Yes. It can be very activating.
So like in my own clinical practice, and just from watching Stephen Levine work with bodies too and with brains, it became intuitive to work with eyes, especially that were bouncing off the walls at a slower pace to help the cerebellum. I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a cerebellum researcher.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And eyes have a lot to do with the cerebellum, because the saccades, the little twitches that the eyes are doing constantly, need to be sequenced and put into a meaningful flow and gestalt by the cerebellum. It's one of the big processing areas for the saccades. And, and if we're just giving too much, or giving more information on a system that's already overloaded with information, sometimes we just need to slow down. And to me, that's like a conceptual backdrop that I have for brain spotting, not having experienced it myself, but having a lot of overlap from the theory perspective and the neuroscience perspective, but also the clinical perspective of the founder, whose name is what's his name again?
David Grant.
David Grant. Yeah, that's interesting.
It's a liberation philosophy in the way that we work in brain spotting. The uncertainty model, that's what we conceptualize the work as, is being with uncertainty and humility and not knowing, not making assumptions about what's happening. And it really throws the Western health complex on its side, because it's like totally opposite from needing to know, needing to direct, needing to be certain, needing to have all the answers, and having an enormous power differential, with our clients. And instead we come in and we trust the innate capacity that each being has for healing, and the survival instinct that lives inside all of us, that life force. It centers that. It honors it, and it tells us to take our cognocentric, patterning that we have living in the Western world and making it take a back seat in the process of healing. And incredible things come out of that in ways that I never would have come up with on my own, but the client's body came up with it as a solution. Doesn't mean I don't help, but it's like I help by being with my full attunement. And it's the most powerful medicine that we have to give is our attunement, since our brains co-regulate off each other.
And one of the reasons why I love the cerebellum, because it's a subcortical structure, and it's, in terms of evolution, it's very advanced. So the neocortex gets so much press for being like at the apex of evolution. And it's like, hello, look backwards. Look who's got your back. You have a 600 million year old, 550, 600 million year old structure back there that's mutated. And now we have this cognitive cerebellum that's doing really, really complex empathy related functions. It's doing not just motor stuff, it's modeling and simulating and predicting futures. You trip over a log or whatever and correct your gait. The cerebellum is working like this to just, it's just incredible, right? And it really is like, compared to old world monkeys and other great apes, our cerebellums are like way more advanced, as compared to the rest of the neocortex. So like, for example, a macaque monkey cerebellum is about 33% of its entire brain volume. But for humans, in terms of volume, 80% of the surface area of the brain is the cerebellum. So and it's all it's like the underdog at the back of our head.
Yeah.
And if you roll it out, it's like a meter long.
Oh my goodness.
And it's just, it's this incredible organ, but again, it's subcortical. And again, it's like this tradition in Western medicine to try to look for what's called what of course in the literature is being called executive control, which is like, okay, thanks for picking a capitalistic model for the brain, and even the neo-Buddhists are, because it's the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology that's basically chosen that as a functional terminology for functional processing of the neocortex, executive control, which it sucks. I hate that,
Executive that thinks it's in charge, but it's not.
It's totally not in control. And it's also, if you look at the processing in terms of the brain, the cerebellum and the neocortex are like a figure eight. They're constantly weaving information back and forth like a figure eight through the brain from subcortical to cortical through the midbrain.
Yes.
Through the deep limbic system and integrating emotions, and cerebellum helps to map it and put it into social sequencing and social events and stuff like that. And then again, come back to the eyes, cerebellum is crucial for eye processing. So, I think it's just so important to engage clinically directly with the eyes. So I'm really stoked to hear about brain spotting and stoked to hear about that there's a different pacing out there than EMDR. Because the fast pacing, I think, is just, and I've seen it happen clinically because I still use EMDR. I use tactile stimulation more than the eye movements. But when I see the eye movements all over the place, I'll get people to track in my own way, hey, can you please look at my finger? And so I'm doing, my version of it, like Brian spotting. I've been doing Brian spotting.
Yeah, you can simply ask, where do your eyes want to go, right? Where are they feeling drawn, or where do your eyes want to magnetize to? And it's that instinctual response that it's called a gaze spot. So that's what you're identifying in a session, is where folks automatically gaze to in different areas as they're talking, thinking, feeling into, the issue. And we can then pinpoint it and hold on it.
In terms of like your clinical experience over time, you have this catalog of eyes, where they look and what they're experiencing. Have you mapped any patterns? Is there like a topography? You see these in somatic therapy, you often see some of these formulas, and I'm not much of a formula guy, but there can be patterns. Like one of the formulas is, if a person is looking up regularly, they're in their head. And then maybe you can see a shift over time if they start looking downwards, and then the feeling starts coming up. Do you see patterns like this, or?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's through the brain spotting ethos. We don't assume that, I saw this in 10 people, so then the 11th person is going to have that as well. But we take note of phenomenon, and we can use that in guiding the client's, process. If we've noticed this interesting thing, like you're talking about, looking up often can mean the client is in their head, they're thinking, maybe they're avoiding, right? Not wanting to go into the body, right? So it's like you're literally looking away from the body, right? The head's moving up, etc. But you can have brain spots that are up here that are related to something entirely different. So we always look for a spot brand new every time. And we don't come at it with the assumption that, this happened over here, so it's going to potentially happen to this person. But we notice the phenomenology of it. So yeah, I've noticed patterns like the one you just shared. I've noticed people looking down often can feel shame.
Yeah.
Right? Or maybe they're in a younger part of themselves looking down, making themselves smaller, curling in. You often see body movements come along with the eye positions as well. Looking constantly at the eyes. Your practitioner's eyes can be like a form of making a connection, looking for safety, or it could mean, a threatening type of thing as well. So if you think of, like in India, for example, we as children are taught to never look your elders in the eye. It's a form of disrespect. So cultural meaning also happens with what our eyes are doing. It's related to culture and eye movement and what our eyes do, where they go, where they're allowed to go, can have meaning. I know a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with eye contact, right? And they look away. They're not making eye contact because it's very intense or dysregulating. So we don't make assumptions, but we bring a lot of curiosity and can see patterns over time.
Great. So there could be a moment where we're doing the exploration, we're looking for that spot, and it could be that the clinician's eyes, my gaze goes to your eyes, and that's where I'm feeling the big feelings.
That's the brain spot. Actually, the eye contact position is the most powerful brain spot there is, because it takes us back to the maternal gaze, feeding. It has a very direct effect on our neurobiology and our attachment networks. So I actually will do eye contact sessions, like full sessions of eye contact processing with people. It's very powerful for repairing attachment rupture, and being seen, being witnessed can have a lot of meaning. So,
yeah, powerful. So when do you bring out the auditory dimension, the What did you call it? Bilateral?
Yeah, it's at the
Bilateral.
beginning.
It's at
Yeah.
the beginning.
We just have them put it on at the very beginning before we get started. Otherwise, we don't want to interrupt the processing. Once it goes subcortical, we don't want to disturb that too much. So we get all the logistical things out of the way, volume and music and all of that.
Okay. And then what, you have a period of having them close their eyes and do the audio first before you do the visual, or
They
it's all
have-
together?
Yeah.
Oh, so you're doing the logistical and then but you don't do it every session. You don't do the audio every session.
Depends on the client. Some people want the music all the time, every time. Some people don't like the music. They don't have to use it. Other people, they may depend.
As a somatic practitioner, do you get people up moving in gravity too sometimes, or doing, hey, let's do a couple minutes of breath work or something like that? You bring in somatic elements to the brain spotting process?
Absolutely. It can be blended in. The main question that I ask if I'm going to add anything in is this for me or is it for the client?
That's a good question. It's a good question.
Yeah. Especially when things are in trauma work, right? Can get gnarly sometimes. Like people are having very strong, powerful releases, and brain spotting is very gentle and very intense at the same time. The focal eye position really creates this intensity and gentleness, like combined. Yeah, client led. So the main thing I ask is for clients to let me know, is it at all intolerable for you at any point? If it is, then, I'm going to do something. And if it feels attuned, I may offer something like breath or something like sensory motor or completion of something, screaming into a pillow, yelling, pushing, whatever, But brain spotting is a non-directive approach for the most part. So I'm very careful about when I make an offering. And it's always an offering, never a command or a demand, because trauma and compliance go together, right? If you've been traumatized, you likely had to comply or do something you didn't want to do, right? So everything we do to shape the session is always free for the client to say no to or decline.
With eye movements, there's patterns. Sometimes there's twitchy elements. Sometimes there's, when a person gets into process, it's almost like the eyes sometimes want to move.
Mm-hmm.
And you just go with that, eh? You just go with that. If we go back to Wilhelm Reich, this somatic psychologist, was a lot about what he termed undercharged versus overcharged.
Mm-hmm.
Like when there's just a lack of energy in the eyes, a lack of vitality, versus like laser beam eyes, just kind of like, I got to thinking, like with dissociation, you have the 1,000-mile gaze thing.
Yep.
Where there's just a sense of diffusion.
Yes.
How do you work with diffusion like that when a person is dissociating because their eyes aren't sure they're going somewhere, and there might be tracking neurologically in a direction that's associating to a brain spot, but it's almost like a field of diffusion.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work with that?
Yeah, lots of ways. I mean, we have many different tools that we can bring into a session. You can see the goggles that are sitting there where one eye is covered or the other eye is covered. They look like this, blacked out on one side. So if someone is, experiencing dissociation or they're feeling overwhelmed in a session, we can put these on. There's another one on, covers up the other eye, so we can ask them questions to determine which goggle would fit better. But that can help lower the activation, and then people kind of come back online again. I've seen people, even with the diffuse, if they're looking at a spot, be able to metabolize the dissociation out of it and come through to the other side of it. We also work with the oculocardiac reflex. So looking near and far, when you move your eye muscles, if you look at something near you, you can see that laser beam, right? Like the laser beam is usually more sympathetically arousing. And so something close to us is going to create more of a sympathetic response as we look near and our ocular muscles point inward. You look through it, and now my eyeballs and the muscles are outward like this. And so this is the dissociative 1,000-mile stare, comes from usually this position of the eyes and the eye muscles. And it's more parasympathetic, or the dorsal arm of the parasympathetic, which creates the freeze or dissociation or collapse. So we can actually have people toggle back and forth, near, far, on the spot, and like look at the spot and then look through the spot, look at the spot, look through the spot. And usually it starts to then like break up the dissociative capsule.
Oh. Meanwhile, you're talking, you're saying stuff here, right? You're offering possibilities, right? You're saying stuff. There's processing. They're kind of processing your voice, because it matters how you speak, right?
But how fast, the tone, what and you're almost imprinting your voice into the flashback or whatever it is that the client is experiencing. If they're non-responsive, they're really stuck in it and struggling, you can even like move your face in front of their eyes and make that eye contact with permission, and start to imprint a new image. And
do you bring in humor?
Yeah. Humor, softness, play. Absolutely. Humor is something I've had to learn. I'm a very literal person. So yeah, I would say that it can play a huge role, and used appropriately, of course. Trauma work is heavy stuff, right?
Yeah.
Frankly, laughter is one of the most powerful ways to discharge, right?
Oh my gosh, for sure.
Right. I've seen it happen where I see the client lip starting to curl upward a little bit, and I might, gently ask, "Hey, what is that? What's coming up for you?" And they've got a giggle stored inside, and we help to get it into its full expression. And wow, does that regulate people's bodies? So
It's so powerful. It's so powerful. There's a term I think it's called uwe, from the native Hawaiian, which is a term for laughing and crying at the same time.
Yeah.
And there's something about that as like a spiritual principle where the binaries collapse and we're just in a discharge state, and it's
ecstatic.
It's
when
ecstatic.
You like that, right? When it's like two polarities coming together. So
yeah, because I've had people processing deep, heavy trauma, and somehow we find our way in. This is like so anti-cookie cutter. There's no way we could make a cookie cutter to say, this is sort of what you need to say when a person is in their trauma to get humor going. Yeah, good luck with that one.
Be very, dude.
Good luck with that one. Let's put that in our protocol book, right?
Yeah.
Say this or say that. No. And it can be really some of the most powerfully healing stuff, when a person finds their way into the laughter. You and I had been talking a little bit about cultural complexities before we click record, and about your journey with Resma Menakem. One of the critiques, similar to my critique of trauma resolution processes in general, is exactly that, the humorlessness, the rigidity and the humorlessness. It's not an easy task because trauma is almost not almost, it's like antithetical to humor. It's not funny, almost by definition. By definition, it's not funny. It's trauma.
Right.
It's such a paradox to consider that humility and humor are often a necessary part of the trauma resolution process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I often sit with that dilemma, right? Like, how do we talk about these heavy topics, not just clinically with individuals, which I think in some ways is easier than the big topics like systemic oppression, which are utterly not funny, and still working with individuals in clinic? How do we find our way into the lightness and the goodwill, and just to lighten things up and have a laugh together? Because we're human and we like to laugh.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It comes up in breath work a lot. And people are processing, and we can even ask, so that like initiate, let's just laugh, and invite people to do a really pronounced laugh, which starts out fake and then turns real very fast. And I often will sing to my clients too during session or in breath work. And so there may be little things that come up that soften and lighten the space and connect us to I would say our more tribal, communal, ritualistic kind of ways of being, song and dance and movement and laughter, imagining us sitting around a fire and doing what humans used to do. So
Yeah, Robin Dunbar, the Dunbar's number guy, has this great phrase. He says, laughing is grooming at a distance. And same thing about singing. Singing is grooming at a distance.
oh wow.
Like neurologically, like that's what's happening. And he poses the idea that in order to break through a glass ceiling of how many people we could bond with as a community, we needed to figure out singing.
Wow.
So we could co-regulate bigger numbers of people, right? And grooming, you can only do it with one person, or maybe you can do it with three. Some people have a way of doing cuddle puddles or whatever, but like singing is like you really can access a lot of bodies with singing.
That's true.
Singing's got a tremendous potential.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see here. So I did mention Resma Menakem. Folks out there might not be familiar with his work. Would you be willing to share a little bit of your journey there in terms of the light side of the moon and the dark side of the moon? You get my meaning?
Yeah. Resma's work is very, very powerful. It was an awakening for me, for sure. He's a teacher and works in helping people to embody anti-racism practices and create a new culture of more embodied ways of connecting and relating. So I spent about 2.5 years with Resma in his somatic abolitionism training program, and got to really awaken to things that were held in my body, our bodies, the cultural body, when it comes to systemic oppression, racism, and many of these other isms, looking at the historical and the individual, the ancestral, the generational, and really looking at it from a structural lens of like, how is this passed down and how does it show up, not just energetically, but, and spiritually, but how is it showing up practically in the spaces that we occupy? It was a powerful reckoning. There's a lot of getting under the dissociation, the collective dissociation, and touching the stuff for what it really is. And there's a lot of charge there. There's a lot of pain and a lot of unmetabolized trauma.
Yeah, you mentioned a degree of invisibility within the abolitionist training because of your Indian roots, and felt like there was some myopia in terms of being able to see you and your unique history and your unique wounding as a colored individual.
Yeah, and I like that in a lot of spaces, even in other therapy spaces where it's BIPOC or people of color. I find that a lot of women and also people of Asian descent go into this like model minority myth, and we're invisibilized, and like it's just the design of what's happening in the world getting mimicked in these spaces and these microcosms. So yeah, it did show up, and it's like how much of that is my own traumas now showing up in a space because it feels like there's a space that I can work with it now, and then how much of it is the design of the space is centered on other individuals because the people who are leading it have those identities as well, which I respect. but it leads to that same kind of re-traumatization of like, oh, there isn't a place for me. There isn't a place for me. Those things can come up, did come up.
You also mentioned the image of layers. Layer, and it's what's true in therapy work is true also, and there's a lot of overlap with cultural work.
Yeah,
Right? Lots of layers in there, and often we encounter a layer of rage. About the things that didn't happen or that did happen that were traumatizing and subjugating. But then one can get caught in a layer. You know what I mean? Like I was stuck in the layer of rage towards my mom for like, I don't know, arguably 8 to 10 years.
Me too with my dad. Yeah. I think like 17 years of that one. Let it simmer down. Yeah.
And I want to honor the work that's coming from Resma, but I was getting what you were throwing down earlier, that, because I worked with a lot of students that are big into his work. There's a quality of a layer, a holding layer in that work that just feels, I'm not feeling the unity and love of, hey, we're in this great project together called collaboration and one love, and hey, let's do this fucking thing together.
Yeah, that he has a different medicine.
There we go. That's a great segue into talking about medicine.
There's a place for 1,000-year-old rage to have the voice that it has, and it's a beginning, right? And the thing with SA, with somatic abolitionism, that we were kind of taught from the beginning was that this is an emerging, evolving body of work. It's not, here's a set of things that this is what we stand. And so, my hope is like Resma's work popped the bubble of collective dissociation that was sitting over the United States related to all of this. And there's more that's going to be needed to help us all evolve into what you're talking about, this collab. And that takes time, and it takes people coming together to do the work and learning how to relate to one another in many, many different ways. And the stuff is insidious because it's so invisible. So it's like we could sit and ask, how is it showing up in any given situation, and how fast we reflex to being in those positions that we've been told we have to stay in and not step out of. So there's pros and cons to it, but I see it as like a point in time. And if you zoom out far enough, it's like, well, this is what it's looking like right now. What is needed, with everything going on and the cultural mayhem that you were talking about. Now I'm like, we need unity. Like, I hope enough people have woken up from this pre-work so that we're moving into collective, communal, taking power away from the government and like bringing it back into our small groups and communities and relating to each other in ways that are beyond rage, beyond distrust, beyond, and going back into that true, authentic human relating. And let me just say this, learning how to have conflict, yes, how to have repair. Gosh, we suck at it as a society.
Yeah.
We don't talk about forgiveness. We don't talk about reconciliation. It's cancel culture. It's cut. You get removed and exiled. But we don't know how to sit and have restorative alliances. So that's why, That's
I really
learn how to do.
Well, and this is why I love, I had a session with David Bridell, the clown trainer, who's talking about, doing activism work through the portal of the clown, the sacred trickster. And then also I've always been, since I ran into Malidoma Somé and Sabanfu Somé's work with ritual grieving, public grieving rituals. What's his name? The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller. These people are offering alternatives, to the repair process where you have ritualized grieving. And to me, it just totally lines up. It makes sense. Can't we just get together and grieve the suffering rather than throw weapons at each other in regards to like he said, she said, whoever said, and then just the war of opinions, the never-ending war of opinions?
Agreed.
We all hurt from the never-ending war of opinions. And where are the places that we can go to just grieve that it just hurts?
Yeah.
You know, I just think that's that's to speak of medicine. Grief is such a powerful medicine in that way, collective grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That's those are spaces that are more and more needed right now.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could say a little bit more about medicine, like your work with medicine, because you were using opioids. You were in in your dive to get your mud where the pressure shattered you. You were using drugs and medicines, in a way that was part of the shattering. And then you started to coalesce around your mud, started to put yourself back together and put your brain back together. You're finding the spots, integrating nodes in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
How did medicine work come back in to support your work as a healer and your ongoing path of growth?
Yeah, it didn't happen for some years. So I was actually like very anti-psychedelic growing up. Even in my youth, like I'd done psychedelics and I was like, oh wow, that was horrible. Let's switch to the other stuff. The dopamine inducing drugs. So experiences, I had early on compared to how medicines hold a space in my life now is very, very different. So the set and setting thing does, come into play, the intentions. And yeah, it was, I over about a decade in that I waited to work with any more entheogenic medicines. So of sobriety, I've primarily worked with medicine in a ceremonial context, and it's taught me the ceremony, right? The ritual of ceremony has taught me a lot about life. And it really is a microcosm of how life moves, how the way things move in a ceremony is a representation of the altar of life. So I've learned much about, the unity and everything that we were talking about earlier of how to be together in a space with people from different walks of life. And I've had really beautiful, amazing teachers, connecting like the condor eagle prophecy. That is the main kind of worldview that I come out of from the medicine standpoint. They are allies and beings, living entities and beings that have cosmic connection and can be a part of guiding us as a species, into our evolution. So my relationship with them is one of deep reverence and respect. And also because of the capitalization of everything that happens in, this Western dominated global economy and culture, I have great pause with it as well. A lot of hesitation around the mainstreaming of medicine and how quickly I've been in the field, for some time now. Let's see. Yeah, 4 or 5 years now doing, ketamine assisted psychotherapy and the training and psychedelic training, MDMA training, et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen what I was hoping it wasn't going to happen, right? Like people were not going to turn it into the Starbucks of psychedelics. And then that's what's happening in a lot of spaces. And again, it's like simultaneous, seeing so many people benefit and also seeing harm. And so it's always taking things with a grain of salt and looking at it from a larger perspective versus that myopic view that we tend to have in any industry or anything, at least in the West. We don't look at things from a collective perspective. So,
yeah. the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think there's a lot of idealization about what they could offer as like a holy grail for healing.
Yeah, that they are not. It's the same. If you come at it with same instant gratification socialization that we have around instant gratification, I think that it's a setup for disaster. We're looking for something on the outside to cure the ails of the inside, and yes, we can have tools and relationships, but it's not the end all be all. And it's really, the ceremony is really after you leave the ceremony, right? After you leave the session on the...
Well, my kind of joke, somewhat ominous joke, I have a couple ominous jokes about psychedelics. One is that the people that most need to use them are least likely to use them.
Yeah.
That's point A. And then point B, which is a little bit maybe slightly more contentious, is that the most powerful anaconda ceremony would be when all the great trippers on planet Earth get together from these different tribal traditions and say, we're going to have the deepest, profoundest trip that we've ever had together, and we're not going to take the medicine this time.
Sounds good to me. Yep. Yeah. That's it right there. Yeah, the medicine's just the key that opens the door. And, I've heard teachers say that eventually the goal is that we live in the frequency of the medicine without the medicine, that we don't need the medicine anymore. So, and we apply the teachings into our daily lives.
We've touched into the word divisiveness has come up. I think this is the age of divisiveness. That's as if to say that divisiveness wasn't there maybe from the beginning, arguable, but it's reaching, unprecedented
Correct.
amounts.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that's been there since the beginning of organized religion has been exactly that the world's great religions have been so profoundly divisive. That you have within the Abrahamic religions. And it's like, folks, in my book, I write about that all of these, great religious, Abrahamic traditions, they basically have a magical origin, shamanic origin. Where the wise men from the East or whatever then get appropriated and the angels get absorbed in the founding figures. The angels get absorbed by the founding figures, similar to how in, for example, African-American cosmologies and anthropologies, you have the magician, the shaman getting absorbed by the imperializing king. So the function of the magician gets absorbed by the imperialist, by the king, by the African king, by the dudes, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's the thing that I talk about a fair bit in my book is like, okay, well, where's the magic that we can all share together?
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm looking for. My whole life is trying to figure out how do we find what connects us all?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so you've clinically now, in terms of medicine, you use the combo stuff, the frog juice. Yeah.
Frog juice is why. Yeah, medicine wise. So I work with ketamine and cannabis because it's legal.
Cannabis, I'll be darned.
Cannabis and psychotherapy are so compatible. It is amazing.
Because there's so many folks out there, just like the consciousness fascists or something like that, where it's like you come to therapy sober and that is how therapy happens. If a person comes, and there's still people in supervision circles all over the place saying if a client comes to therapy high, turn them away.
because of our harm reduction model. So, and a human model.
Yeah, right. I mean, I always thought that was a bit. I always thought it was a bit
Therapy.
bonkers.
Sorry.
Yeah, I always thought that was a bit bonkers. Like when somebody shows up altered, I'm like, okay, we have a different doorways here, and
Correct.
let's talk, let's connect, let's be human, let's explore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, ketamine and cannabis pair very nicely with somatic work. Low dose. I do low dose ketamine sessions paired with somatic work, as well as the higher dose journeys, more transpersonal journeys with people. I prefer the lower doses because it's much more relational, and you can get at stuff with ketamine since it's so dissociative. So down regulating enough to where we can get access to things that we couldn't quite without medicine. Cannabis is phenomenal. I'm getting ready to teach a training on that later in the summer. It really balances the autonomic nervous system. So if you're, in hyper arousal, it can help bring it down. If you're in hypo, it can help bring you up. So it has these really powerful balancing qualities. And so you can use different strains to work with different types of folks and conditions and really get access. It will bring sensation to areas that if you're dissociated, you don't have sensation to. So it essentially gives a lot of access to things, which I really appreciate. So, and, speaking of psychedelics, here's one of the sides of it is that, everyone's like popularizing and idolizing, psilocybin and ayahuasca and, all these other peyote and all these medicines. And yet we've had, Madre Cannabis with us all this time through so many cultures across the world. She really only just wants to help us with food, with, clothing, with hemp. Like you can use hemp for so many different uses that could be angled on a conservation lens for planet Earth, right? And support the reduction of, all this production that we have and using hemp instead. And she's got like more than 100 uses for medical ailments, spiritual, physical, emotional ailments. So easy to access, relatively cheap, yet she's demonized.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's refreshing to get a different lens on it, because you hear, because I taught psychopharmacology for several years and ran into some really interesting, solid research about, especially with people in their 20s, that there's a 4 times more likelihood that a person will have a psychotic break if they're using regular cannabis. Now, regular cannabis these days means like hypertrophied THC, just like mega cloned and like THC gargantuan stuff. And obviously people are going to be propelled into psychosis with that level of, it's crazy, right? So, I mean, so it's refreshing to hear somebody that's like, wait, let's, I assume you're familiar with the literature about it and that you're cautious about it and that you use it, intentionally. And that's what I'm hearing you say. So that's refreshing.
Yeah. And then there's same thing that the cannabis of today is not what it was 40 years ago. And so the potency is off the charts. And so we're not sitting in my office having, 10 tokes of something. It's just a couple, enough to.
Yeah, it's freaking wax these days. Like somebody it's like people are doing wax, calling it wax. I guess it's like,
yeah.
And it's like, that seems like it might as well be an ayahuasca trip or something.
There's certain blends that can be used that actually very much mimic psychedelic experiences and like mushrooms and ayahuasca. And so that's what I'm saying is that here's this thing that we have that when used judiciously and appropriately, we can have so much healing from it, even very similar to an Aya ceremony or other medicine ceremony, but it's much more accessible. It doesn't last as long. It's easier on the body. Yeah, many angles, many angles.
It's very different when you use it therapeutically as opposed to, hey, let's just toke and go to a movie and eat some Funyuns or something. Sure.
Yeah. And I think I said this before we, got on the recording, is that the decriminalization of plants and medicines is my stance on all of this, is that people have the right to change their state if they want to. And the government not to have anything to do with policing that, in my opinion. So, in fact, I think it creates a whole lot of other problems when we get policed. So, use responsibly, as they say.
Well, maybe next time we can talk about Bedouin spirituality.
We didn't quite get to that. I wrote it down. My Google search.
Well, it seems like, it's one of my great teachers once said, healing often comes from the margins.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so it's like the margins of the great religions, like, for example, esoteric Islam,
Mm-hmm.
And the Sufism and creative imagination of Ibn al-Arabi and things like that. And the fringe Catholicism, fringe Christianity. It's at the fringes a lot of times that the healing comes from. Right?
Beautiful. Yep. I would agree with that.
Gilles Deleuze, a great philosopher, thought that the Bedouins are like archetypally fringe, archetypally marginal, because they're nomads. And same thing with the Inuits.
Mm-hmm.
It's the nomads and nomadic thinking. I wanted to mention Frantz Fanon before when you were talking about Menakem. I don't know if you've run into Frantz Fanon's work, and we could anglicize it and say Frantz Fanon was just a brilliant early challenger of the racialized body and articulator of the racialized body, and just a genius psychiatrist. And he actually, maybe 40, 50 years ahead of his time, thought that the racialized body had a lot to do with the midbrain,
Wow.
the periaqueductal gray, which really lines up with my research and Jaak Panksepp's stuff, and it being the grand central station of emotion and the brain and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also, he really honored Wilhelm Reich and was like, what the hell did America do to that guy? What the hell did America do to that guy? He had some great ideas about cosmic energy and how to access cosmic energy, and hey, how do we get people to breathe and get into their bodies clinically so that they can plug into the great mystery.
Probably got shut down real quick.
Well, he was a marginalized figure, right? And that's what, Deleuze is on about, the Inuits, and you have these nomadic thinkers that can, not camp too much in one place and get stuck in a layer for too long, but to stay free like the wind on some level. And I'm feeling that with you. I've been putting out, okay, where are the Velcro hooks? She got some of those Velcro. Pretty good. I'm feeling it. Yeah. And that just feels so good.
Good.
It really does. So I just really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your journey and your wisdom.
Yeah, really, really appreciate you. It's very nice to have a spiritual and intellectual conversation with someone who's a thematic practitioner. So we're a different breed. I would say we live in the subcortex. We live in the shadow. We live, keep one foot in the mystery and one foot in the physical world. So
well said. Well, I think that's a great place to pause. Blessings to you. And a good work in the world. And take care.
Thank you for listening to the Boundless Body Podcast. Please like us, share, subscribe, and until next time, stabilize, catalyze, and thrive.